And so during the World War II incarceration experience, there are all these kinds of stories involving cars and trucks that you just may not assume when you have this incarcerated population. But camps needed motor pools in order to transport, do deliveries, ferry people around these basically these small towns. Those motor pools were almost exclusively manned by Japanese American mechanics and drivers. And so you have all these stories about the motor pools. And the motor pools were very powerful within camp politics because they performed a pretty important need. I found stories about adolescents in camp stealing cars to joyride. So, even behind barbed wire, they're still engaging in these kind of youthful pursuits around car stuff. And so to tie this into what you're asking, it doesn't strike me as being remotely unusual then that interest in cars would then carry into future generations. So now jump forward a generation and, the early years in which people actually start making pilgrimages back to the camps. This took I think the first pilgrimages weren't until the 1960s, if I'm not mistaken. The Day of Remembrance, I don't think started until either it was was that the early 80s? So, it took decades for people within this community to kind of revisit this obviously deeply traumatic experience and begin to not just talk about it, but then to pursue justice around it. But cars wind their way into this too, because what is a pilgrimage if not involving driving back to these sites, some of which people had to drive themselves to get to, like, Manzanar in March of 1942. Hundreds of families started in a caravan from the Rose Bowl. This is in March of 1942. They gathered in the morning at the Rose Bowl in Pasadena and then had this 4-mile long caravan to drive themselves to Manzanar to be incarcerated and to have their cars impounded and then later basically sold to the government without consent. And, there's a kind of eerie, full circle, or I don't know if you would call it irony, but when the pilgrimages begin, what's happening is people are getting back into cars and they're taking caravans back to these spaces in which their parents and their aunts and uncles were all incarcerated during the war.